From 1966, we just heard the Lovin Spoonful with You Didn't Have to Be So Nice, a song written by John Sebastian and our guest today, founding member of the Lovin Spoonful, bassist Steve Boone, who's just released a book about his adventures in and out of the Lovin Spoonful called Hotter Than a Match Head. And it's certainly an incendiary read. I don't think the career of the Lovin Spoonful has been quite so well documented until this book. Steve, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
Before we start going over the past, let's talk about this book. Why now?
Well, it was sort of do it now or don't do it. I had, as you know from the book, a recording studio in Baltimore in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And about 4 years ago, a fellow called me up wanting to do a story in 2008 on the recording studio. He was from Baltimore, but he actually lived in Philadelphia at the time, and he had a job as a sports announcer, but he was a true Baltimorean, and he knew about the studio, and he wanted to do an interview. So I said, great, he sounded like a good guy. And the article came out so great when it came out in the summer of '08, or '09, that I asked him if he would consider working with me on doing a book, because that was the only way I was going to do a book, is if I had a writer of his caliber to work with me on it. And when he said yes in the fall of 2009, we were on the road to going, but still miles apart. And then, like about a miracle out of the blue, his job got transferred to Florida, where I was then living. Mm-hmm. And so we were close enough to get back and forth in person, and the book then became a 3-year trot to the finish line. We never raced, and we really had a good schedule, and it worked out really good because of that. So yeah, that's why.
Well, it is an amazing book. You've had one heck of a story. I want to, if I can, go back to the very beginning, even before the Lovin Spoonful, and talk about some of the music you were listening to that informed not only your playing, but your love of music.
Well, you know, that's a real, it's a big subject, but it's really can be narrowed down. In 1955, I was about 12 years old. Mm-hmm. And so I'm at that point where I'm starting to become musically aware and growing up a little bit, aware of girls and all those kind of things that 12-year-old boys go through. My brother Skip, 6 years my senior, had a rock band in we were living in St. Augustine, Florida. And he had a rock band that was one of the first in that area, and he was doing real well, but it really inspired me to kind of take a step back and look at music from a musician's side. But what I was listening to was a little different than what Skip was doing. I was like listening to my first song I ever bought, and this is probably off the wall, but it was Who's That Behind the Green Door? And it was the first 45 I ever bought, and it was just a novelty song, but it caught my ear because I became a fan of pop music. I used to love the Hit Parade show on television.
Sure.
And then gradually, right about 56 and 57, Buddy Holly, Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, Everly Brothers, that comprised my core base of people. I really loved their music. And maybe of all of them, Buddy Holly made the biggest impression on me. When I heard Peggy Sue on the radio one day, riding back with my neighbor from racing his little race boat on the river, I said, this is something I want to get involved with. It was such a unique sound, and his singing style and his guitar playing and the drumming, everything about Peggy Sue said, this is something new and different, and I just loved it. I fell in love with it.
Well, it's interesting because you sort of took a left turn in the very early 60s with the early formation of the Lovin Spoonful, because you were heavily involved in the folk music scene.
That's exactly right, because, you know, in 1958, I moved to Long Island from Florida, and at that time, the rock scene had gotten what I thought was just a little bit vanilla. It really wasn't inspiring me. The Everly Brothers were turning out their hits, but just about everything else was just not really doing it for me. And then, of course, Buddy Holly and Richie Valens and the Big Bopper had died in a plane crash, and all of a sudden, I got attracted to this new sound, and it was the first album was the Kingston Trio. I heard it on the radio somewhere, and I went out and bought the album, and I loved the way they were combining guitar with vocals and songs that had more lyrical quality to them than just boy meets girl and girl meets boy.
Right.
And so that led me to Bob Dylan and, of course, Joni Baez and a whole bunch of people. My brother was also transforming himself into the folk music scene. When I graduated from high school in 1961, I had been, as you probably know from the book, I had a terrible car crash in 1960, and recovering from it, I had learned how to play guitar because I couldn't walk around. I was literally, essentially homebound for over 18 months. And so learning the guitar, the easiest way to learn it was to pick up these folk songs and go to beach parties where my friends were, bring the guitar along, and play Michael Row the Boat Ashore and those kind of tunes. But what it did do was it gave me the link between enjoying music as a listener and playing music as a performer. And then all of a sudden, now I'm in my last year of school, I'm playing guitar at beach parties. When I graduate, my brother Skip and Joe Butler, the future Lovin Spoonful drummer, had a rock band, and they invited me to join the band, and that as a rhythm guitarist, not as the bass player. So I stepped right into that. I was already pretty good on the rhythm guitar, and that was an easy job to take. But then the bass player, who was a person in the Air Force, and he was retiring and going back to Louisiana, he said, "Steve, why don't you take over the bass guitar?" He said, "You've got a great sense of rhythm. I think you'd be a natural fit on the bass." And he was right. I loved the instrument from the very first minute I started playing it.
It's only a few years later that the Beatles hit, and that changes everything again.
That not only changed everything from a perspective of the way bands are perceived by the public, but it opened the door for something all of us musicians had longed for, and that was to be able to write your own songs and play on your own records in the studio. You know, prior to the Beatles, it was the rare band, Buddy Holly being one of them, that was allowed to go into the studio with the lead singer writing the songs and the band playing on the records. And when the Beatles came along, and they, with their enormous success doing the same thing, then when we got to the record company and said, we want to play on our records, the record company really had no heart for saying, no, we want you to use studio players. And then, of course, as the 60s took off and folk rock began, and then that turned into more of the art rock and hard rock, but it was really birthed in the ability to play your own records in the studio, which never had really happened prior to that. So that was a big development for us.
That was yet another chart hit for the Lovin Spoonful, 1966, Did You Ever Have to Make Up Your Mind? Our guest today is bass player for the Lovin Spoonful, Steve Boone. Steve, it must have been just astonishing to you to have success right out of the gate with your very first records.
Well, you know something that was so interesting because, and I think about this a lot today, you know, the Lovin Spoonful, you take them apart as their individuals, and none of us had really fabulous success after the band stopped touring.
Right.
As solo performers. But put us together, and the 3 or 4 times that we got together as a band in the 70s, 80s, and then for the 2000 induction into the Hall of Fame, we sounded like we hadn't skipped a beat. We went down, we rehearsed, the next thing you know, the band is just dropping jaws. We were sounding so good. So my point is that the Lovin Spoonful as a band was almost like a veteran operation when we hit the stage for the first year of our existence. We just had that, I hate to use this term, but we had that magic. And it really worked for us. And it was just something that, as I look back over the years, you know, I wonder how the band would have been today if we had not stopped touring and had stayed together. Of course, Zolly's not with us anymore, so that's sort of a hypothetical that it can never be, but it makes me think about it a lot. That yes, we were successful right out of the gate, but I think the reason behind it was we just clicked as a quartet of musicians.
It's interesting that you bring up the band concept of the Lovin Spoonful, because I think most people, and I don't say this with any disrespect, but I think most people consider the Lovin Spoonful to be John Sebastian and the other guys. But in reality, you co-wrote some of the group's biggest hits with John.
I'm really glad you brought that up. John is a dear, dear friend of mine, and I think he's one of the finest, maybe the finest all-around musician and songwriter I've ever worked with. And I think that's a mistaken impression. Now, John, of course, wrote the majority of the songs that we did. And, yes, I did co-write Summer in the City, and You Didn't Have to Be So Nice, and Full Measure, which were all charting songs.
Yeah.
And I'm also the king of the B-side. I've had the B-side on so many of the records. I had Butchie's tune on the back of Summer in the City, and Full Measure was on the back of Nashville Cats. Anyway, it goes on and on. We had a lot of Never Going Back, had Forever on the back. So I think that it's fair to say that John was perceived, the band, what happened to the Lovin Spoonful was like we disappeared into thin air. It was all of a sudden we went out there for the first 2 years. Every song we released went into the top 10.
Yep.
And then it was like all of a sudden the band had just disappeared, and there was no real explanation given except the lingering rumors of the drug bust. And so the drug bust sort of became the band's history. And there's no way you can kind of get that story straightened out because there's a million different versions of it. What really happened is nothing to be proud of, but it did happen, and it did, effectively put an end to the band. But you got to read my book to know the real story about what really happened and the reasons for it. But the band just kind of disappeared, and when you just kind of disappear, your fans don't know what to think. Where is he? Or are they, I mean? And so I think that when John came out in 1975, I think it was with Welcome Back, Kotter,
right,
it put him back into the spotlight again. And I think from that, and also he appeared at Woodstock, and I think those two things served to put in the audience's mind that John was the key man of the band. And in many ways he was. I'm not disputing that, but I think that the fact that we just disappeared without a good explanation says more about why the band's history is not more well known by the general public.
And you go into that in your book, and obviously I don't want to give it away here. I mean, it's a heck of a story. Basically, the rock world turned its back on you guys.
Yeah, it did, and like I said, it wasn't the finest moment in my life, and I'm sure in Zolly's life either. I think one of the things I can say in our defense was that we were the first rock band of any significance to get arrested from a drug bust. It was for pot. And without telling the whole story, the choices made, the managers and the record company had no playbook for us. If it had happened a year later, they would have known who to call, who to ask for advice, what advice to give the band. But really, we were just four guys and the management and record company, and we were just all like, well, what do we do? What do we do? Nobody knew what to do. And without some kind of guidance, you've got the chief of police of San Francisco breathing down your neck, and Zolly's deportation was imminent. The next morning, we were told. So what I did and what Zolly did was I took a powder. I fulfilled an obligation to produce a band that I was working with for Mercury Records, and then I bought a sailboat and headed out. I really had no intention of coming back. And then I know Zolly did essentially the same thing. He worked with Chris Christopherson for a while, and then he just went back to Canada, got on TV up there, eventually started a restaurant, which is still in business today. His daughter runs it in Kingston, Ontario, called Chez Piggy. Very successful restaurant, I might add. And so we just wanted to get away from it all. It was just a weird, rocky road, with hard to navigate, troubled waters, and all of these things that sort of I wasn't expecting. Like you said earlier, we had such a right out of the gate success. It seemed like everything we did for the first year was good. It worked. It was a success. When we came back from England in May of 1966, just before the drug arrest happened, we had the Beatles coming to our show. We had played at a party in Ireland for all the rock royalty and actual real royalty for the 21st birthday party of the heir to Guinness breweries. And it was just one of those events when people were talking to us the same way they talked to the Beatles. And it was like, I'm not saying we were in the same class as the Beatles, but and we knew Summer in the City was just about to be released. When we got back in April of 1966, 2 months later, we knew Summer in the City was coming out. And it was the first song that we did that everybody in the band and the record company and management all agreed that this was our first big #1 hit record, which it turned out to be. So come May 1966, the four of us thought we were walking on water. We were just so strong, and we felt so good, and the band was clicking on all 8 cylinders, and it was just one of those things where all of a sudden, out of the blue, this completely left field incident happens, and the next thing you know, everything that you had been depending on is now kind of crumbling under you.
The Lovin Spoonful, right here on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. Our guest today is bassist Steve Boone. And before we start to wrap up here and move on to other things, just to get back to that drug bust for a second, had that happened today, that would have been on TMZ for 5 minutes and then forgotten about. In a way, the Lovin Spoonful just became a victim of the times.
That's perfect, man. Yeah, that phrase really works. It was a victim of the times. And, look, you can't reverse gears and say, wait a minute, time out, I'm going to go back and fix all this. That can't be done. But, the band's music is intact. And the music we created in those 3 years that we were together, for better or for worse, it's intact, and we're all very proud of it. So that's our statement. It's too bad that we couldn't have kept going. The band today, the Lovin Spoonful today, with Joe Butler, myself, and Jerry Esther, who replaced Solly when he left. It's a fabulous band. I've asked John on several occasions to join up with us, but he just has no desire to play in an electric band again. He has, issues with his voice, and he doesn't want to have to compete with electric instruments. And so, God bless him, and I'm all for him not trying to push it if he doesn't want to. And we would love to have him join the band, but the band today, and I can tell from the reaction of audiences, is as popular with those fans that knew us from the 1960s that are still coming to our shows today. We worked up in Canada 2 weeks ago, and the audience, I've never had such compliments after the show about how much they enjoyed it and how it sounded terrific, and we all look like we're having a great time up there. So really, we're carrying on the music, and we'd love to have it be the original band, but Zolly's no way he's going to be back.
Right, of course.
And then John, I respect his wishes to the max, and so we're doing what we can do to keep the music alive for the people that still want to come out and hear it.
It just occurred to me that I've had a lot of guests on the program who are in modern-day incarnations of their original bands, and we've never delved into that and found out how that happens and how that works. Can you give us a little insight on reforming the Lovin Spoonful?
Well, something, you really asked some nice questions that really is something I could wind up and go on for an hour, but I'll just try to be brief because this is a long story. When I came back from the islands and sailing for 4 years out in the Caribbean, I was pretty wound up about wanting to play music again.
Yeah. And
so when I get to Baltimore, all of a sudden, I wasn't planning on starting a recording studio. It kind of fell into my lap because my girlfriend at the time sang in a band, and she was recording at this studio that was, what I didn't know was a state-of-the-art, maybe one of the best studios in the whole country, built by an engineer named George Massenberg, who today is like a legend. He invented parametric equalization and all sorts of things he came up with. He had this studio in suburban Baltimore, and when I went out with my girlfriend for her recording session, the manager, I was introduced to him as Lovin Spoonful's bass player, and he said, would you be at all interested in leasing or buying this studio? And I told him, I said, look, I don't have anywhere near the financial ability to take that on. I said, but I will call my manager from the Lovin Spoonful days. And I called Bob Cavallo up and asked him if he thought he had any clients that could come and record. And he said, you know something? I think Lowell George has been talking about this studio you're telling me about. And I said, who's Lowell George? Because I didn't have the slightest. I had been listening to soca and reggae and calypso for 3.5 years. My only touch with American music was on Sunday on a television I could watch Soul Train. So that was the only music I heard. So I didn't know who Little Feat and Lowell George were. So he filled me in. He said, let me run it by Lowell, because I think he's mentioned that studio before. And then it turned out Lowell had recorded there before, and he loved it. He wanted to come record there. So we made a deal. I got the studio. Lowell got to record with his band and created their most successful album, Feet Don't Fail Me Now. I was in a band that was doing terrific. We were recording new music. It was called Blanche LTD. And we were all doing good, but I, in the back of my mind, was going, why aren't the Lovin Spoonful getting back together again? I'd see Joe. He'd come down to the studio and record. John Sebastian's lead guitarist, Reggie Knighton, came down to the studio and recorded. Zolly came to Baltimore when he was working with Chris Christopherson and when he was working with the National Lampoon Show. So I'd see these guys regular, and I'm going, why aren't we playing? So I started planting the seed. And Zolly had been fired. It wasn't like he just left the band. He got fired, and it's controversial, and I try to explain it in the book why it was controversial. I didn't want him to be fired. I voted against it. I was the only vote for not firing Zolly. But he got fired, and so he was a little bitter about the Lovin Spoonful in 1976 when we were asking him to come and join. He said, why? Why should I do it? His restaurant was not yet happening, but he was doing well with the National Lampoon Show and had worked with Chris Christopherson, so he was doing well. John Sebastian had just had the hit with Welcome Back, so he wasn't inclined to want to go in and start the Lovin Spoonful again. But still, I talked to Joe, and the only thing holding us back at the time, and all four of us agreed on this, was the fact that our record company, Kama Sutra, was not paying us a penny in royalties, and had not since 1970. We had gotten a big advance in 1967 when we re-signed our deal, but they're claiming we never paid back the advance to get the new royalties. I personally had seen enough albums on people's tables to know we had paid back the advance. So we were in a long dispute. By the time 1980 rolled around, we had hired about 3 different law firms, and by 1988, I forget who it was that came up with the name Nick Gordon. It might have been John, it might have been one other of us in our research, but Nick Gordon is an attorney in the music business that worked for a big law firm, and he was one of those headhunter guys that when his letterhead showed up at a record company, everybody got nervous. He was that good. He was that well known for recovering royalties. And it took him 3 years, from 88 until 1991, to finally pin down where the royalty stream had gone and who had ripped off who and who had taken the title. I could tell you for hours about the chain of events where our master recordings got transferred from this person to that person to this person and then back to the original people again. And then they sold it again. So it was just the Lovin Spoonful master recordings were being traded around like lollipops at a kid's party. And then, finally, in 1991, Nick writes us all a letter saying, good news, the settlement is at hand. The new owners of the masters had agreed to pay us an advanced royalty, which was good. It was an increase over what we were being paid when we were being paid.
Right.
And then, after the settlement had been concluded and we all got our share, Joe and I, now we had the money to start up the Lovin Spoonful, and if we sold records, we would get paid for it. So Joe and I sent a letter to John and sent a letter to Zolly. We're starting the band, and if you want to be in it, say yes, or if you don't want to be in it, say no. And Zolly wrote back saying not yes and not no, and that was fair. He was entitled to make any answer he wanted. John, on the other hand, chose to write a somewhat testy letter, kind of saying, who does Joe and Steve think they are playing my music? And I'm sure John wishes he hadn't written that letter. It was not the John Sebastian I know and love.
Right.
But it established something that, unfortunately, gave Joe and I legal claim to the name. So we went ahead and started the band on those terms, and we asked Jerry Yester if he wanted to join up with us. At first he said no, and then he said, well, it turns out because he was living in Hawaii at the time.
Right.
Then he said, I'm moving, by coincidence, I'm moving back to Portland, and I would love to be in the band. And then he said, and my brother Jim is not working right now. What do you think about him coming along and the four of us starting the band? So that's how the band got started in 1991, late 91. We went and rehearsed in upstate New York at a ski lodge. It was obviously closed for the fall, and we got it back together and did our very first gig in Greece on New Year's Eve, 1992. And Jim Yester worked with us for a year, and then he wanted to be more of a solo act at that point, and so he decided to leave the band, and we found a couple of replacements for a few years, and then Jerry's daughter, Lena Yester, joined the band in 1993 and played with us for 5 years, and it was just a great band. I thought we were going to almost do a Fleetwood Mac kind of thing at that point, because we had the great singing harmonies of Jerry and his daughter, Lena, and the band was clicking real good, and we had a drummer situation. Joe had left the drum kit, and he wanted to be up front and sing. He wasn't comfortable singing leads from the drum kit. So we used a few drummers for a couple of years, and then we found this terrific drummer from Chicago, Mike Arturi, joined us in 1995, and he's been with us ever since. He's just a great world-class drummer. And Lena left to go solo in 1998, and her replacement is from Arkansas. He's also a fabulous musician and owns a fabulous stringed instrument store in up there in the Ozark Mountains called Guitar Smith. And so Phil Smith is his name, and now we got that five-piece band, and I think we're just moving along, just sounding great, man. It's just a treasure to get out there and play. We do maybe 20 shows a year, and that's just enough for me to keep my chops up, make a little money, and keep the name out there and have people be able to see Lovin Spoonful live. I'm real proud of the show we're doing now. Like I said, I'd love to see John come back and play some guitar and mouth harp with us, and maybe he will someday. You never know, and so that would be just the icing on the cake if that were to happen. And just before the book came out in December 2013, he did a benefit down here in Florida, and I called him up and said, John, you're about an hour away from me. What if I bring my bass over and sit in with you? And he says, why don't you? So we got together for about a half an hour before the show. He had changed the key on about half a dozen of the songs. He sent them by email to me, so I knew what key to learn them in or relearn them.
Right.
And by coincidence, my publisher was on vacation in St. Petersburg, and he drove over for the show. And he's a huge music fan. That's one of the reasons he agreed to publish the book. He's been such a fan of the music and the Lovin Spoonful, and he said it was one of the best concerts he's ever seen. It just shows you that magic is still there.
We have been speaking with Steve Boone of the Lovin Spoonful today. What a fascinating interview this has been. Steve, where can people go to get your book, Hotter Than a Match Head, My Life on the Run with the Lovin Spoonful?
The best way is my website is steveboone.net. That's all one word, steveboone.net. And on the opening page, there will be buy this book here. Of course, I personally handle the orders and autograph the book myself, so I will mail it out, and that's the best way to get an autograph copy. And I'm going to also be starting a blog, a video blog. I've already begun it as just a written blog, but I'm going to be doing a video blog which will have contests for folks to win the book and for questions directly about content in the book, and that will be announced on the website when it's actually up and running. And then, of course, traditionally, Amazon sells the book, and the best price available is from Amazon. Of course, it doesn't get signed that way,
right.
But they have free shipping and all the kind of goodies that Amazon can offer. And of course, if you go into any big bookstore, the book is published by ECW Press from Toronto, Ontario, and you can order the book at any bookstore, telling them Hotter Than a Match Head, Life on the Run with the Lovin Spoonful, and ECW Press is the publisher's name. And of course, other sources too that are harder to find. If you go to my website, I have links to about 4 other sources, and of course, I still suggest anybody who wants to get a personally autographed copy. And I also include in the autographed copy a collector's card. It was American Bandstand had a limited release of rock and roll bands from the 60s and early 70s. And the Lovin Spoonful card is one of them, and I include one of those cards in every book. And it was just came out for 1 year. That's very limited edition. You'll have a real special extra treat in the book by ordering it from me at steveboone.net.
Steve, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with me. I had told you 15 minutes, but I lied, and I kept you on for as long as I could. Steve, the best to you. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks so much.
Same to you, and thanks.